Capoeira mandou chamar, e eu vim responder.
Nous devons sauver l'Afrique car nous sommes ses enfants. Sékou Touré a libéré ses enfants. Nelson Mandela sacrifice pendant 27 ans. Amical Cabral a laissé couler son sang. Patrice Lumumba, légende de ses descendants. Thomas Sankara a laissé couler son sang. L'Afrique gagnera le jeu juste en se soulevant. Modernisons nos terres pour nos futurs enfants. Quelques histoires de passion ont été décevantes. Nous avons des richesses mais on vit misérablement. Est-ce une malédiction sur ce beau continent? Mes ancêtres m'appellent car je suis leur descendant.
Capoeira mandou chamar, e eu vim responder. O peixe e as águas do mar, era eu, era você. Capoeira eu vou jogar, se você me responder. Do mesmo mar, era eu, era você.
Chuva fina não me molha, quanto mais sereno. Era eu, era meu mano, mas eu vou jogar São Bento Grande ou São Bento Pequeno. Mas agora estou cantando e vou louvando a Deus primeiro. Da laranja quero sumo, do limão quero pedaço. Da morena mais bonita quero beijo e abraço. Negro nascido do chão desse povo de Aruanda. Abençoado por Iemanjé, protegido por que anda.
Capoeira mandou chamar, você vai responder. Lá na beira da praia, lá na beira do mar. Yo, negro preso no navio negreiro. Peixe fora d'água, dentro do desespero. Vida em roda, hora redonda, hora quadrada. Mas em luta, tinda sem glória. Entujado na história de quem que sabe mais, para amores conta melhor. Capoeira é porta para um passado de dor. Distante, mas bastante presente. É resistente, é voz de uma África independente. Capoeira é ancestral, é ponte. Nessa boca tem bimba, tem cabral, é fonte. Nesse corpo tem ginga, tem zumbi, tem mandinga. Nós é peixe do mar, união é ar que vida te respira. É motor que faz o mundo gira. Tem lábios que praxa, que te apaga. Tem sangue que água que te lava. Nós é peixe que trado d'água para fogo na terra de um liberdade branco, torto e manco. Tem feridas que te ficha. Mundo é de forte, então não fortifica. Capoeira eu vou jogar. Já dizia, mas você me responder. Capoeira mandou chamar. E eu vou lhe responder. Vinha lá da praia, Capoeira me chamou. Vinha lá do mar, quando o berimba tocou.
Welcome everyone to episode 10 of Unspoken Podcast. I am Anna Paz, and today I'm giving you the final part 6 of my master's thesis research, coming to voice through Capoeira, uncovering the ancestrality and embodiments of the African diaspora. Now, before I give you this brief overview and get into part 6, I want to let everyone know that we now have a donate button for Unspoken Podcast. Decided that on Substack, I will be publishing some private essays and poems for people that are paid subscribers. But this podcast, I want it to be for everyone. And for that reason, I ask you, if you've been enjoying these episodes, if they've offered you some insight on your journey of learning and exploring more about the African diaspora, then please give what you can, when you can. You can do it as a one-off or a monthly reoccurring donation. And your donation is going to allow me to dive deeper into these topics, to take more time to research and to bring better content your way. Really, this allows me to just take some time off my day job so I can do this, which is what I am enjoying doing, and creating a community that's growing of us learning with one another. Follow Unspoken Podcast on Instagram, subscribe on YouTube, on Substack, and if you have the means, please send that donation on PayPal, and I will leave all the links in the description of the show notes below. Much love to all of you that have been supporting. Now let's get back to episode 10, part 6, which is titled Black Women Embody a History. And just to recap, the first part was episode 3, Awakened Memory of Nature, Ngolo. And I explored George Conceição's book Capoeira Angola, Educação Pluriétnica, Corporal e Ambiental, and how Conceição beautifully expresses the complexities tied to the body together with the embodiments of nature and our environment. I also shared some reflections on Ngolo, the zebra fight, and why I think it may be one of the predecessors of Capoeira, originating in the south of Angola. Episode 4 was part 2, Kalunga Bantu Congo, Principles of Life and Living, where I mostly highlighted Dr. Kimbawandende Kia Bunsenke Fuyakio, hope I said that right, book's African Cosmology of Bantu Congo, attempting to understand the African cultural material beneath the surface. And we reflected on the 7 directions of life within the circle in community, how that relates to the practice of Capoeira. Part 3 was the Mali Rebellion and the Spirit of Mandinga. This episode focused on the word Mandinga, its meaning, where does it come from, and how the Empire of Mali, one of the largest empires in West Africa, contributed to the traditions and cultures that helped cultivate some of the spirit of resistance in Capoeira. Part 4 was Candomblé and Yoruba Orisha traditions, where I shared some of my experiences that I've had in Brazil, my understanding on a few Orishas, and unpacking and reflecting on those ancestral, spiritual, cultural frameworks that have shaped Capoeira through Candomblé, as well as the role of the Catholic Church in suppressing African and indigenous spiritual practices. Part 5, which was the last episode, episode 9, was titled Point of Orientation, a phenomenology of whiteness. And this episode explored the invisible weight of whiteness as an orientation, as a way to reflect on exactly where our central point of orientation lies and where that dialogue of what moves us and what holds us back begins. And really it was a dialogue also with Bell Hooks choosing the margin as a space for radical openness, and of course Sarah Ahmed's phenomenology of whiteness. And this leads us to that final question, which was actually my first question, or 2 questions that I had, that were the catalyst for my whole research. How can the representations of Capoeira and its history evolve to be transformed when viewed through the perspective of a Black woman? And can these representations bring Capoeira to a space of radical openness? And radical openness, by Bell Hooks, is a space of resistance and transformation, particularly for those marginalized by dominant power structures. So a space where we can envision and create the realities for our desired futures. Even when I say this, it makes it so clear to me how this has everything to do with the concept of quilombos, which is exactly where the seeds of Capoeira were first cultivated as far as we understand it to be. So why is the visibility of Black women in Capoeira spaces so important to focus on? Why is our embodiments, our personal and collective experience important to be aware of? And this is actually one of the reasons why I decided to do an autoethnography. So I decided to do this research through my experience. So I will like to start with my very own personal experience as to why I started Capoeira, and just go on from there as to why I went into researching about Capoeira. And if you've heard some of the earlier episodes, I do give a brief performative introduction, so you can listen to that. I did an audition back in 2018 or 2019, I can't remember. But I think it was 2018, which was the year that I first went to Africa. I went to Egypt. And when I came back from Egypt, I think it was a month later, the news broke out that Marielle Franco, the Brazilian councilwoman in Rio, was assassinated alongside her driver, Anderson Gomes. And I really would love to actually do an episode about her work and life, I'm thinking to do a series on different women around the African diaspora. But I mentioned Marielle because her death really shook me up. It's one thing to understand that thousands of people around the world are being killed, are unaccounted for, and to some degree the state doesn't particularly care unless we, the people, make a fuss about it. And even then, these deaths are not necessarily being investigated in the correct manner. I just came back from Portugal where there was a demonstration that I also attended for a young woman named Maria Luemba. She was 17 years old. She was found by her little brother, tied up in their home, and she was no longer alive. The authorities ruled this a suicide without any proper investigation. And the demonstrations, of course, was us backing the family who are asking the authorities to do a conclusive investigation as to why she was found in that way, what happened to her, what actually happened. So we understand that at times we, the people, have to make a fuss. Otherwise, these stories are undocumented, unheard, not shown on the news. No one knows about it, so no one cares about it. And even then, we have no power in the system necessarily to change systemically what has been happening, how these people are able to get away with killing individuals. Marielle Franco, a black woman in a position of power, speaking up about police violence, serving as the city councillor for her city, and still she was killed. And that shook me up because I think for the first time I really understood that it doesn't matter how accomplished you are, how educated you are, how well intended you are, how visible you are. When you come from a particular background that resonates those who are marginalized, who are oppressed, it does not matter because the center was not created for you to be there. And that was a shifting point for me, to come out of that naivety. And this really stayed with me. And shortly thereafter, I did go to this audition in London for a play. And it involved movement and it needed black people who spoke Portuguese. So I went to this audition, and this whole audition changed my trajectory in my work. Because being in that space with all those women, even before we spoke to one another, I just knew that our stories were connected. And it felt like a coming home. And the piece wasn't based on Marielle Franco, but it was definitely reflecting on the events around her assassination. It was a sort of non-linear narrative that went back in time to tell the story of Queen Nzinga, of Ndongo and Matamba, modern-day Angola, and how those threads of resistance were linked to the present, following a young girl, her trajectory during this time, and other social problems that she was facing, how she came into this journey of Capoeira. I didn't get the role, but when I saw that piece of work, beautiful work, and shout out to Helena Moraes, who I've actually recorded an episode with, so you will be hearing from her very soon, a conversation that we had. But it was that moment that called me to Capoeira. It was that moment that I said, this is also my story. These threads are connected to my resistance, my personal resistance. So I have to do this practice. And of course, this led me to believe that black women and Capoeira were just two things that go together. However, when I began practicing Capoeira, I, more often than not, was the only black woman or even the only black person entirely. And this made me uncomfortable. And it started to pose a question into my mind as to why. How can a practice rooted in fighting oppression, symbolic to black resistance, not have any black women in the space? How exactly is this art being practiced? What is the central value? And at the time of the research, I thought all I wanted to do was explore that more black women have been essential to the spaces of Capoeira than we give credit to. And I do think that this is something that still needs to be explored and documented, which is definitely shifting in Brazil. And of course, in Capoeira, there are several corridos, songs that speak about women, black women. There is so much presence of black women, whether it's Dona Maria do Cambotá, Dandara dos Palmares, Maria Felipe, several Marias. And we really need to talk about how common this name Maria is in the Lusophone community. We also have Aide. And Aide, I was reading actually from this channel, Cores de Aide, which is a samba reggae group in Brazil. And one of the members, I just quote what she said, Aide is part of our identity. A mythological figure in Afro-Brazilian history, she is in the music, in the corridos, in Capoeira. She was a black woman, enslaved, whose master fell in love with her, who offered her her freedom in exchange for marriage, and she refused. She ran away to a Quilombo Camugere, where she realized her freedom and that her love does not have a price tag. We identify ourselves with Aide because we see ourselves represented in this. Our values are not neutralized. We cannot pay for our affection. We do not negotiate our political position. And all of this is in Aide, in that black woman who is fierce and carries all of our ancestral knowledge. End quote. And I think it's super interesting to mention these stories even when some of them are considered myths or mythology because they've come from somewhere. Especially stories like this, there is a form of reality that speaks to some aspect of our history that is an embodiment of that resistance that is very real. A very real reality that was lived, that has shaped us. But we don't get those stories fully documented or even spoken because of our position in society. But that does come through in other ways. Our bodies carry it and we transmute it into different forms. For instance, during my research, I came across Paula Faltron's article for Sankova, which widens this discussion on the erasure of history, particularly when considering Capoeira Angola. I found a picture from the 1960s taken from the archives of Emilia Biancardi of Mestre Pastinha standing over what looks like a class with two black women playing. And it seems what has been dismissed for so many decades is that question. Who are these women? What are their stories? Faltron notes that in conversations with great masters who were students of Pastinha like Boca Rica, João Grande, they insist that there were stories involving women capoeiristas before the 1940s. And even in Mestre Pastinha's own manuscript, there were names such as Julia Figueiredo or Rosa Palmeirão. According to Faltron, there's studies that suggest that there's involvement of women in capoeira going as far back as the 18th century, with figures like Teresa de Benguela. Or even you could go earlier than that, including the story of Nzinga, of Ndongo and Matamba, which made me think, how far back can you go when you think about the different traditions that have formed capoeira, that are embodied by black women? But to prove this is not easy, or to even have a conversation about this is not easy. For example, in Brazil, the Panteão de Patria e da Liberdade, Tancredo Neves, in Brasilia is a monument which is dedicated to honor the national heroes in Brazil. There was no black women included from 1986 until 2019. There was even a large debate within Brazil about whether black heroines like Dandara or Luísa Maim should be in there. The existence of these women and their stories are not received as legitimate, more like folklore or myth by Eurocentric standards. But like I said, even if some of these stories are myths, they embody a reality that is very true to the history of Brazil and something that may have been difficult to document. And these are the difficulties in many indigenous and African cultures that pass down knowledge and stories through oral traditions. And when you're in extremely oppressive, racist, patriarchal societies, these knowledges can be forgotten. And this happens due to the biases inherited in how our histories have been recorded. It is not seen as legitimate, especially within a period where what is considered factual or legitimate has to be accounted for through a white gaze, centered within Western European standards of knowledge first. And this is why I think it is so important to do research and to engage in decoloniality, which is a way of thinking that practices to challenge that dominance of Western perspective and institutions, and it attempts to validate other systems of knowing, other ways of being. And this is all very important and relevant to the conversation of Capoeira. All of those unspoken stories, those stories in the margins, that may even be central to the whole, but we never really get to have a dialogue with it. But now I realize that that also was what I was attempting to understand in my body, what I was feeling, this sense of knowing whilst not knowing, but understanding that something was present. And this is where my research is now expanding, towards understanding the body as an archive of memory, and just how African technologies, bodily memory and communication are carried by Black women across time and the Black Atlantic. And I'm continuing with this focus on Black women because I am a Black woman, so I am also starting from me, because knowledge begins from where you are. But it's not just to highlight their involvement in Capoeira that has largely not been documented, but to consider even how Black women, our bodily knowledge, could be central to this practice, into shifting into a space of radical openness. Beyond that, though, to this practice that functions fundamentally through an African spiritual system. And in a traditional African worldview, when you remove it from its colonial lens, the woman is the center. That doesn't mean that men don't have their place, but women are seen as the center, as the source of knowledge and its transmission to the rest of the community, the portal to this realm and to the other side. So this is about understanding things, I guess, from this more matriarchal point of view as opposed to patriarchal. This process of this research gave me an opportunity to practice this, how to move from the margin to the center and back, how to consider how I am sometimes in the margin or in the center. It was also a struggle to remember to unpick who I am in each moment, to feel something in my body, to collect that memory, not to forget, to interrogate it or reclaim it. And through my experience, I was able to understand that it was not only my lived experience, but it was an inherited history, an embodiment that Black people and Black women hold, not only in Capoeira, but in society. I was able to mirror our experiences. With many different conversations that I had with Black women, I reached the conclusion that we must reckon with the embodiments that we hold, awaken all aspects of the histories and the memories that we are carrying in our bodies, start to have a dialogue with our bodies to understand how the past, the present, and the future are always in conversation with one another, just like in the Roda of Capoeira. I want to thank everyone for listening to this episode. I was fighting to record this because there was people mowing their lawn outside. It was rain, cats going crazy in the living room. I do hope you enjoyed this episode, which marks the last part of my series on coming to voice. If you want to read my whole dissertation, I will leave a link. I have a link on my bio on Instagram. I'll also leave a link down here on the show notes. And I just want to thank everyone for coming on this journey, for being open-minded to what I have to offer through my experience and through the things that I find interesting in researching. And yeah, let's continue this dialogue. I'll see you on the next one.